All right, so it looks like we have quite a few people on board. Let me remind everyone of the rule. You gotta put on your video. All right. I like to see faces, not names. Okay. All right. If you're driving in a car, that is fine. Don't put on your video. Okay. I don't want to see a crash. Okay. So be safe. All right. I know those roads. I know those roads. Okay. All right. Very good. So we have enough faces. So let me share my content. 2, 8, 4, 5. All right. Everybody see the PowerPoint? Okay. Very good. So today we're going to talk about research on populations prone to being vulnerable. So we're going to talk about the concept of vulnerability and what does that concept really mean? The two major points I want you all to get out of this session is that if we're going to involve people who are vulnerable, and we'll talk again what that means to be vulnerable, is that we need to justify why we're involving vulnerable populations in our research. And once we justify the reason why we're involving them, we have to think about what additional safeguards or protections are needed for these individuals in order to advance their welfare and protect their rights. So again, two major points. Could we justify why we're involving vulnerable people in our research, and what could be additional protections to safeguard their welfare and protect their rights? So how do we define vulnerability? So there are two senses of vulnerability. One, to be exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. Some other words could be being defenseless, unprepared, frail, weak, helpless, in danger, at risk. So, for example, I don't swim too well, so if I fall in a lake, I'm vulnerable to that harm of drowning. Now, the other sense of vulnerability is liable to succumb to temptation or manipulation. What that means is that if you're in a vulnerable situation, someone could take advantage of you. Someone could exploit you. Someone could put you into research without actually either knowing that you're in research, or putting you in research when you really didn't want to be in research, or maybe you didn't understand the potential risks. So that's the major concern of being vulnerable, is that investigators could exploit you. One of the greatest research ethics abuses that have occurred in the past were due to investigators targeting vulnerable people in their research because they were easy to be manipulated. That is something we need to avoid. So the international guidelines I mentioned previously, the CIAMS guidelines, they define vulnerable persons are those who are relatively or absolutely incapable of protecting their own interests. More formally, they may have insufficient power, intelligence, education, resources, strength, or other needed attributes to protect their own interests. And we'll go over specific examples of this. And as I said before, special justification is required for inviting vulnerable subjects. And the means of protecting their rights and welfare must be strictly applied. Another definition of vulnerability is that vulnerability in the context of research should be understood to be a condition, either intrinsic or situational, that puts individuals at greater risk of being used or exploited or taken advantage of in ethically inappropriate ways in research. So that is the major concept, being used or being taken advantage of. So I use the word intrinsic and situational. I'll define that in just a few seconds. Now, vulnerability is really a two-part definition. One has to be substantially unable to protect oneself. That's the internal part. And then also one has to be exposed to the possibility of being harmed. And so you need both parts. One is vulnerable, and then one is in an activity like research where there is the possibility of being harmed. Both elements are necessary, and here one definition of vulnerable is to be vulnerable means to be exposed to the possibility of harm while substantially lacking ability and or means to protect oneself. Now, in that definition, the two major words are possibility and substantially. So one is vulnerable and you're exposed to the possibility of harm, and we'll describe what types of harms occur in research, while substantially lacking the ability. Now, I use the word substantially because, in a sense, and I'll explain this later on, actually, we're all vulnerable in some sense, in some activities that we do during the day. And so we're talking about individuals who are more vulnerable than other people. And we'll flesh out that concept in a few minutes. So, reasons for vulnerability in the context of research, as I said before, there's intrinsic and situational reasons for subjects unable to protect themselves. And well, before I continue with that, I want to ask you a question. What are the different causes or types of vulnerability. All right, so I'm going to put you to work. Go to menti.com and use this code. Let's see. Right. Go to menti.com and use that code and just tell me what are the different types or the causes of vulnerability. All right, mentally ill. All right. Good. Poverty, disability, economic, physical, social. All right. Conflict, affected zones, age, sex. Okay. Poor. Okay, these are good answers. All right, yes. Children. Yeah. All right, children. Low intelligence. Intrinsic. Okay. All right. Good, very good. Let me, people who are writing down, help me understand. How does poverty cause poor power, right? How does poverty make one vulnerable in research? Start actually writing down in the boxes. Help me out here. Why does poverty cause one to be vulnerable? Is there something about poverty itself that causes someone to be vulnerable? I mean, you could be in poverty, and poverty makes people powerless. Okay, because they have less economic means. All right, I like that. So now, in the context of research, does poverty itself make someone less powerful than the researcher? Let's keep on. Poverty makes people powerless. More likely to be taken advantage of. Okay, incentives in research. All right, very good. Yes, incentives. Where was that? So one major concern is that treatment is expensive. So if people do not have adequate access to health care, they may be more likely want to join a research study to get extra health care. Okay, very good. And I think that is one of the major aspects of poverty. Yes, likely to enroll for incentives and treatments. Poverty in and of itself doesn't cause one to have low intelligence, though if you're thinking that people in poverty are less likely to have a good education. Okay. All right, good. These are really good answers. All right, so let's explore all. Those are really good answers. I'm not sure why I'm here. You guys are really good, but let me give you the formal presentation. So intrinsically lack decision-making capacity, like the mentally ill children. So that's an intrinsic mean. Situational, we're talking about political issues, social issues, economic circumstances that makes subjects vulnerable to either being exploited, being taken advantage of, or undue inducement, or when the incentive is very high, people, we say, are being unduly induced to be in research. So types of vulnerability, again, regards to decision-making incapacity, cognitive vulnerability, unable to express yourself, communicative vulnerability, and then economic, and the major issue there is the undue inducements. And then another major category is what I call dependent relationships, or inadequate power. And types of dependent relationships we call informal, socially constructed power imbalances. So patients and physicians, think about that. Patients are always dependent on physicians and healthcare providers. Essentially, patients are very dependent on healthcare providers for their health, and they may be put in what is called a coercive situation, in which, now, I think I defined coercion before as being in a position where if you say no, you're going to be in a worse off situation. So a lot of patients feel that if they say no to their physicians, they may feel they won't get adequate health care if they say no. In other words, they'll be in a worse off situation if they say no, especially if it's their physician who is asking them to be in a research study. That's why in the informed consent form, it is very important to write in the form that you have the right to say no, or the right to withdraw from the study, and there will be no penalty for saying no, or there will be no penalty for withdrawing, meaning that you will still get the same type of health care even if you say no. Other dependent relationships, parents and children, students and employees, citizens and government. Other types of dependent relationships include situations in which there's a lack of freedom, and we're talking about prisoners, military, refugees, internally displaced persons. I had a case study on the website, the hepatitis E vaccine study, and I think we should use that study. I'm not going to discuss the study in this presentation, but I would like to discuss that study on the discussion forum. And that involves a lot of issues about coercion, exploitation, dependent relationships, and other issues involving international research. So again, a long list of people in dependent relationships. Now, we have this concept of medical vulnerability. Essentially, potential participants who have serious health conditions for which there are no satisfactory standard treatments. For example, metastatic cancer or rare disorders. So these individuals are desperate to get medications for their illness. And when they're desperate, they may be inadequately able to consider the risk and benefits. So we say that patients who have metastatic cancer and they've tried all the standard chemotherapy, now there's a new study with an experimental chemotherapy, they may be desperate to join the trial in order to live longer. So there's a concern they may be exploited by investigators. So we call this a medical vulnerability. And there's this concept of a social vulnerability. And this involves participants, potential participants for research who belong to an undervalued or marginalized group. And hence, there is a negative social perception of such individuals that can lead to discrimination and exploitation. What I'm trying to say is that there is such a negative social perception or a stigma associated with such individuals that people think that one could exploit these types of individuals very easily. So we call that a social vulnerability. So the other concept I want to explore is that, and this is what I was getting at when I was talking about substantially vulnerable, is that, and I said that in a way that you could say that we all have some types of being vulnerable in certain situations. So is the concept of vulnerability too broad, too wide? What I'm showing you now is when I used to submit a protocol to my IRB, they asked this question: Will you be recruiting any of the following vulnerable population? Select all that apply. And here's the list: employees, children, women of childbearing potential, educational disadvantage, critically ill, pregnant women, students, prisoners, all this list. Take a look at this list. And my question is, who's left out? It is very rarely that I checked off none of the above applies. This included almost everybody possible. And so I'm just thinking it's sometimes the concept of vulnerability is that too broad. Also, if you look at the regulations, like the Belmont Report, the U.S. regulations, the Helsinki and SIAMs, they list either a long list of categories or terms that are very ambiguous, which again raises the point, is vulnerability too broad of a concept? So, as I said before, all human beings are exposed to the possibility of harm, but not to the same degree. So, this is why I have the definition as such. To be vulnerable means to be exposed to a significant probability of being exposed to a harm while substantially lacking the ability to protect oneself. One example would be, we have this broad category, the mentally ill, but there are different degrees of being mentally ill or different degrees of lacking intelligence. Not everyone who has some kind of defect in intelligence could be considered being vulnerable. It just means that with certain individuals who lack some intelligence, it would just take us longer to explain the informed consent. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're vulnerable, because again, what we're talking about are people who substantially lack the ability to protect themselves. So, having gone through this concept or a vulnerability and the different types, let's I passed out this case study about medical students and individuals who are abusing illegal drugs. So let me go over the case and we'll have a chance to discuss it. So there is this study that's assessing the effectiveness of a new anti-anxiety drug. And medical students are being asked to enroll in this study. They're being asked to enroll in this study by their professors in the medical school. And before obtaining full informed consent, they are asked to participate in a screening procedure to determine who might be experiencing high levels of anxiety in certain situations, because they only want to enroll medical students who has a propensity to be very anxious. Actually, I never met a medical student who wasn't anxious, but they're looking for really anxious medical students. And such individuals are asked to enroll in the study. The study procedures include randomization to study drug or placebo, some blood draws, physical exam, and 3 one-hour-long interviews over the course of 6 months. And they will be paid $500 during the duration of the study. Okay? Now, we have another study. Oh, where's the, oh. I thought I had, the drug abusers. Well, let me tell you about their study, okay? So we have individuals who are abusing drugs, and they go to a clinic for their treatment to try to get off abusing the drugs, and they have hypertension, and they're on a drug for hypertension. And now this study involves a new type of antihypertensive drug, and they are asking these individuals if to enroll in the study, in which case they would be randomized to this new drug, experimental drug for hypertension, and they'll be randomized to the new drug or to the old drug. The study would involve clinic visits 8 times throughout 2 months, and they would get paid $25 per clinic visit every time they show up to the clinic visit. So again, the drug abusers, they attend this clinic to try to get detoxification, in other words, trying to get off their dependence for the drug, and they are asked to enroll in this study involving hypertension. So my question to you is very simple. Which group is more vulnerable in this research study? Yes, in this research study. Are the medical students more vulnerable, the drug abusers, or you're not sure? All right, 2 for the drug abusers. All right, 1 for the medical students. Okay, yes, the medical students. All right. Oh, 7 for the. All right, another 1 for. Okay. All right, not sure. Oh, no. All right. We're going to analyze this. All right, 1 not sure. Okay. All right, 2 not sure. 9. 13 responses. All right, we'll give it another few more seconds. Any other final votes? All right, another. You got to vote because there's a not sure answer. Okay, right? So there's no reason for not voting. If you can't make up your mind, just say not sure. This is anonymous. Trust me on that. All right, what do we have? 12, 14, some maybe, I know, one person is driving, so maybe you can't vote. Okay, I understand. Okay, all right, good. So most people think the drug abusers, but I find it interesting that several people did say the medical students. Okay, very good. So let's so I have this rating scale. Let's analyze it based on the type of vulnerability. And so we have several different types of vulnerability: cognitive, intelligence, dependence. Which group has a higher degree of being vulnerability from being in a dependent position? Economic, medical vulnerability, again, meaning that they are somewhat desperate to have a new type of drug. Social vulnerability, are these individuals looked upon as having marginal value, and who has legal vulnerability? So I want you to think about this for a few seconds, and let's analyze this very carefully. So now let me all right, so this one is, so we have the scale: high vulnerability, low vulnerability. So in terms of cognitive, which group of individuals would have a higher degree of cognitive vulnerability? Medical students or drug abusers? Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, I guess you're also answering about dependence. Good. All right. So who would have a higher degree of dependent vulnerability and cognitive? Okay. All right. So only 9 people voted. I don't have a not sure category here. Okay. All right. So looking at the cognitive, I think we are clear that the drug abusers have a cognitive vulnerability. Medical students, less so. I'm trying to. Why do we think people who abuse drugs have a cognitive vulnerability? Why are you guys saying that? Is it I guess maybe we're assuming that people who abuse drugs from the lower social economic portions of our society, and they may have poor education. But I just want to say a lot of people who have good education also abuses drugs as well. I just want to put it out there. But in general, I do agree that it's more likely that the drug abusers would have a cognitive vulnerability. Now, dependent relationships, now we have the difference a little narrow. So the medical students, if their professors are asking them to be in a research study, they're in a dependent position for sure. No doubt about that. If the medical students are going to feel like if they say no, they're going to be in a worse off situation, like not getting a good grade. Now, why are the drug abusers in a dependent position? Maybe could someone help me out there in the chat? Or unmute your microphone? And explain to me how are drug abusers in a dependent vulnerability? Is anyone writing anything down? They need treatment, which is one time. Okay. All right. Well, the study. Now, if you're talking about treatment better than the standard of care, we may be thinking more like a medical vulnerability. But are they in a dependent vulnerability? Are they thinking if they say no, they would be in a worse off situation? Now, I think I did mention that they go to the standard one if they say no, but presumably they're on good treatment with the drug that they're on. When we're talking about dependent relationships, we're talking about insufficient power between two individuals, okay, or two entities. So the only thing I understand the standard one if they say no. The only thing I could think about with the dependent vulnerability is that I mentioned they were getting health care in the clinic being detoxed, that they might feel that if they say no, they won't get health care from the clinic. Having said that, I really do think, having been a medical student myself, I really do think that they probably have a higher degree of dependent vulnerability compared with the drug abusers. Okay, all right, good. So let's talk about the let's see. What are your thoughts about economic vulnerability and medical vulnerability? Who has the greatest vulnerability between the two? Who has the greater economic vulnerability? Who has the greatest medical vulnerability? All right, let me have your answers to that. Oh, okay, good. Economic, medical. So remember, medical vulnerability, who would be more anxious to get the drug? The medical students in regards to an anti-anxiety drug, or the drug abusers getting a new type of anti-hypertensive drug? And then the economic vulnerability. How many starving medical students are there? I don't know what's the cost of medical schools in Myanmar. Okay. All right, good. A lot of you have answered. Well, it looks like a narrow difference in economic, a wider difference in medical vulnerability. So I do agree that medical students are getting paid $500. That's, you know, they might be earning more money in the future, maybe not, but that might be a lot of money for them. The drug abusers, $25 per clinic visit, well, that might be a lot of money for them as well. So again, economic vulnerability depends on the incentive. Now, medical vulnerability, the way I analyze it is that the drug abusers are already on an anti-hypertensive drug, and they're doing well, and so they don't have a desperate need for an experimental drug. Whereas the medical students, you know, they're an anxious group of people, and they may be desperate for a new type of anti-anxiety drug. So they may be somewhat vulnerable to that research study. All right, good. So good thoughts. So one last question here. Let me present that. So in terms of social vulnerability, who has the greatest social vulnerability and then the legal vulnerability? Okay. All right. All right, good. So, yes, big differences in both categories. Surely drug abusers are looked upon as being undervalued in our society. Not so much for the medical students. And legal vulnerability, well, if you're abusing illegal drugs, then you might be more vulnerable to legal issues. So again, we're talking about an anti-hypertensive drug, and hopefully there's a high degree of protection of privacy in these studies. So hopefully drug abusers will not be we do a lot of studies on people who are engaging in illegal activities, in which case privacy issues would be very important. So overall, let me get back to right. So overall, I think probably the drug abusers. However, the medical students, I think the major issues for them would be the dependent vulnerability for sure, much greater than the drug abusers, and then the economic, depending on the social situation, medical students might have more of a economic vulnerability. Okay, all right, very good. So it's useful to tease that out about why a person might be vulnerable, and there may be different reasons, more than one reason why a certain person might be substantially vulnerable. So in the to whoops. Right. So in the last few minutes that I have, I want to talk about this concept of special protections. If we're going to involve individuals, again, we need special justification. Let me just we need special justification and additional protection. And essentially, the U.S. regulations says that if we're involving subjects likely to be vulnerable, okay, we need additional safeguards. Well, let me just get back to the justification. The major, in fact, the only justification to involving vulnerable subjects is one, we're studying an illness that affects them, like mentally ill or children's diseases, okay? And also, we cannot do this study on individuals who are less vulnerable. So, getting back to the drug abusers, okay, we're studying hypertension, which affects them. However, we could have done that study on other individuals who are less vulnerable than drug abusers. The only reason to involve people who abuse drugs in research is if we're studying an illness that affects their drug abuse. Other than that, we should not be enrolling people who are abusing drugs. You could say the same thing for medical students. Could we be enrolling individuals who are less vulnerable? So another example would be prisoners. The U.S. regulations and other regulations state that if we're going to enroll prisoners, it has to be a research study that is studying a condition that's unique to prisoners. So it could be a study involving the prison conditions, issues faced by prisoners while in prison, okay? We have to involve people. The research study has to involve a health issue that's unique to the vulnerable person. So one would be concerned if one is assessing an antihypertensive drug and you're going into the mental institutions to enroll the mentally ill. There is no reason for that because you could enroll a less vulnerable population. So getting back to special protection, there's a claim to special protection when there's an increased likelihood of being exposed to a harm or wrong. Now, the types of harm is increased risk in a study, a breach of confidentiality or privacy, invalid consent, and then lack of access to the benefits of research. And so if we're dealing with individuals who are more likely to be vulnerable and are more likely to be harmed, then we need special protections. So type of special protection, well, in regards to risk, we may want to put a limitation on risk. And some regulations say that if we're involving vulnerable groups in our research, the risk has to be low. That's one special protection. A breach of confidentiality, if we think that a breach of confidentiality is going to cause more harms to the vulnerable subject, then we need stronger confidentiality protection. If there's a concern about invalid consent because of low intelligence, we may want to get consent from a surrogate or a family member, or we may want to assess their understanding if we think their low intelligence is preventing them from understanding the subject matter. If there's going to be a lack of access to the benefits of research, again, this is a situation like where drug companies are doing studies in low and middle income countries. We want to make sure that one, the study is responsive to the health needs, and two, that they'll have access to the drugs after the research is over. More specifically, in terms of protection, so if we're dealing with a situation where there's a dependent relationship like prisoners, students, employees, okay, some type of protections could be no inappropriate or excessive incentives, keep the institution from knowing the identity of the participants, okay, so like if we're dealing with employees, okay, and let's say the employer is doing a study, then we have to make sure that the employer doesn't know the identity of the participants or the identity of who refused. The informed consent has to state clearly that participation is voluntary, okay, and without any penalty or without any retaliation for saying no. And recruitment procedures should not involve direct solicitation from the superior. So you don't want the employer recruiting subjects. You don't want the military commander recruiting military. You don't want professors recruiting their students. And if possible, you don't want the physician recruiting patients. You want the investigator, and if at all possible, the investigator should not be the patient's personal physician. In terms of medical vulnerability, like terminally ill subjects, the consent form has to clearly state the potential risks and benefits. An impartial third party or patient advocate should be involved with the informed consent process, and potential subjects should not be approached immediately after diagnosis. So you can't, on one hand, tell the subject you have terminal cancer. Oh, and by the way, we have a study. Okay, that's inappropriate to do that type of recruitment. Economic, dependent, or impoverished subjects, you have to set the compensation at a reasonable level to avoid any undue inducements. Consider alternatives to economic compensation. So in some studies, we pay sometimes research participation a lot of money. And the concern with undue inducement is that people may not consider the risk, so you have to make the risk clear in the consent form. Social vulnerability, you want to keep the data confidential, consult with community representatives to reduce the potential for stereotyping and stigma, and you want to make sure that the consent form, if need be, translated. But more importantly, you actually need the community to help be the patient advocate when they are asked to enroll. And then, again, the major safeguard concerns the justification. As I mentioned before, the research is intended to obtain knowledge that will improve diagnosis, prevention, treatment of diseases or other health problem that is characteristic of the vulnerable class. That is, the best safeguard is having a strong justification for involving those individuals in your research study. Those are the major issues I want to talk about vulnerability. All right, any remaining thoughts? This is where you could unmute yourself, or what's been happening in the chat box. Okay. Any remaining questions about vulnerability? So it would be interesting to the research that you're involved in. I am sure a lot of the individuals you're recruiting your research have a lot of different types of vulnerability. The thing is, what type of special protections are you providing? That's the major thing. So in regards to social vulnerability, that's a very important point. The issue with the social vulnerability is the essence is that certain groups are undervalued, marginalized. They're not looked upon by society in a very positive way. And hence, individuals will think they could take advantage of them. And also, if people feel like they're being marginalized, undervalued by society, they may feel that they can't say no. That if they say no, they'll be even more marginalized and undervalued. So it comes from both ends. One, the investigators thinks that they're so undervalued and marginalized that they're not even considered, part of the country, that we could involve them in the study. I think an example might be the Tuskegee study performed in the early 1930s, where investigators wanted to study the natural cause of syphilis, and they in African Americans, and they enrolled African Americans, and the African Americans were marginalized, undervalued, and they weren't told a lot of information about the study. They were given spinal taps, and they told them it was treatment. And so it's if you undervalue a person, you're gonna take advantage of them. You're more likely not to disclose all the information, and the other way around, the undervalued person may feel they have to say yes because they're undervalued. Now, another part about the social vulnerability is that there's the concept, as we explained before, that especially if you're doing illegal activities, then if you might suffer more stigma, or if you doing a study in which you're looking for a gene for a mental illness, and the person finds out they have that genetic disorder, or even if you're doing a study looking for a cancer gene, and the person has that cancer gene mutation, that they may suffer social stigma after the study, or if the results of the study becomes public, that they may suffer social stigma. However, I like to make a distinction between suffering stigma because of the study. Here we're talking about vulnerability in the sense that you're more likely to be enrolled in enrolled in the study when you didn't really want to be in the study. You're being taken advantage of. So all that stuff about you may suffer stigma if the results of the study become exposed. That may be true, but that doesn't mean you're vulnerable before the study. We're talking about enrolling patients against their interests. And so this concept of vulnerability, you have to, are we talking about being vulnerable before the study or being more vulnerable after the study? I think we're talking about before the study. This is where enrolling people when maybe they didn't want to be in research. A lot of people don't want to be in research. A lot of people are not necessarily enrolling in these vaccine studies for COVID for various reasons. So, which gets to the point of legal vulnerability. The issue about legal vulnerability, and I mentioned this before, is that there's a concern that if there's a breach of confidentiality, individuals may be exposed to legal harms or social harms, not social harms, but legal harms if the government finds out that they're abusing illegal drugs. But that's after the study. We're talking about are individuals who are engaging in illegal activities, are they more vulnerable to wanting to participate in the study? And that might be a harder concept to unpack in the sense that if someone is engaging in illegal drugs, are they more vulnerable to wanting to be in the study? And that may be a more difficult question to answer, unless one could say that someone who is engaging in illegal activities may feel that that the investigator knows they are engaged in illegal activities, and that person may feel that they concerned that if they say no, they'll be in a worse off situation because somebody knows they're engaging in illegal activities. So that's how I would explain legal vulnerability. So I do think a lot of people confuse vulnerability with what's happening after the study. But we're talking about people being used or exploited to be put into the study, not after the study. Another issue would be a lot of people say pregnant women are vulnerable. Now, why is that? Could someone help me out here? Why would women who are pregnant be considered vulnerable? Now, the fetus is is vulnerable to physical harms by being in the study, okay? But what about the woman? Now, sometimes when I ask that question, I get answers like, well, women are very emotional when they're pregnant. I don't say that, okay? Not me, okay? This is what people tell. In fact, the people who tell me that are women. They're the ones who tell me that, okay? Well, I don't believe it, okay? So I'm not understanding why women, particularly when they're pregnant, should be considered vulnerable. The only thing I could think about is the issue with the fetus, and that's why we tend not to want to enroll pregnant women or women of childbearing potential to be in drug studies because of the concern with the fetus. Though there are some illnesses that affect pregnancy, like hypertension, diabetes, in which if we want to study those type of illnesses, then we need to enroll women who are pregnant. But we have to be very concerned about the fetus. So, thanks for giving me a few more minutes to explain the social vulnerability. Again, it's the vulnerability that happens before the research as we recruit individuals, and we don't want to use individuals in our research studies. That's the issue, is are we targeting individuals unfairly? So again, it might be useful to look at the research you're doing and understanding, because I know most of you, if not all of you, are doing research involving people who are prone to be vulnerable for a variety of reasons. The issue is, what are the special protections you are using? Okay? All right, so that's my final point. Okay. All right, so, you know, I had mentioned before, I gave a presentation to this group at University of Medicine 1, and I gave a presentation to them at 9 o'clock this morning, your time, okay? And after I gave the presentation, I said, I'm going to bed, okay? Because it was late for me, all right? So now, okay, I could say, after my presentation, I could tell you, good night, have a good night's sleep, go to bed. Okay. All right. We'll see you next week. All right. Thanks a lot. Okay. Take care.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye now. Okay. You can unmute yourself and say goodbye. Okay.
Thank you, Prof.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good night's sleep.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Prof. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
All right.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah.
Thanks, Han, for your help. Okay. All right.
Okay. Bye for now. Have a nice day.
All right. So I'll get you some information about research coordination. Okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Very good. Excellent.
Thank you.
All right. We'll see you.